Hey y'all, so today we're going to talk about the book Decolonizing the Mind, and I'll give you like a little summary, and then we'll get into like my favorite quotes. I'm not sure how to get the little glare off my glasses, but we're not going to worry about it. So the book itself is written by Thiong'o, who actually recently passed away. And he's discussing language, the role of language within decolonizing our worlds, in a sense, especially when the fact that he's like really set in post-colonial studies a little bit, or at least he's a voice for post-colonial studies in a sense, because he spends a lot of time talking about the way that language plays a role in culture, history, and our identities. And so his book is divided into four parts, which is the language of African literature, the language of African theater, the language of African fiction, and the quest for relevance. So the book is really organized around these chapters or essays in a way to discuss the way that language can play a role in language can play, but also does play a role in how we remove ourselves from the colonial worlds that were set forth, especially after transatlantic slave trade, and during that time. But also, possibly, I think he also discussed ways of considering how to move forward. So, just a little preface, a little definition. Decolonization is the meaningful and active resistance to the forces of colonialism that perpetuate the subjugation and or exploitation of our minds, bodies, and lands. Just a preface before I read my quotes, but also before I go any further, because people might not know what decolonization means. So, the more you know. So, what I wanted to do was go through and read for y'all, and then kind of post a quote, like I said, that I'm reading. So, the first one is language as communication and as culture are then products of each other. Communication creates culture. Culture is a means of communication. Language carries culture, and culture carries, particularly through orature and literature, the entire body of values by which we come to perceive ourselves and our place in the world. How people perceive themselves affects how they look at their culture, at their politics, and at the social production of wealth, and their entire relationship to nature and other beings. Language is thus inseparable from ourselves as a community of human beings with a specific form of character, a specific history, a specific relationship to the world. The next quote: the real aim of colonialism was to control the people's wealth, what they produced, how they produced it, and how it was distributed, to control, in other words, the realm of the language of real life. Colonialism imposes control on the social production of wealth through military conquest and subsequent political dictatorship. But its most important area of domination was the mental universe of the colonized, the control through culture of how people perceived themselves and their relationship to the world. Economic and political control can never be complete or effective without mental control. To control people's cultures, to control their tools of self-definition and relationship to others. For this, colonialism For colonialism, this involved two aspects of the same process: the destruction or the deliberate undervaluing of a people's culture, their art, dances, religions, history, geography, education, literature, and literature, and the conscious elevation of the language of the colonizer. The domination of a people's language by the languages of the colonizing nations was crucial to the domination of the mental universe of the colonized. And that specifically really reminds me of even the discussions happening when it comes to Israel, and the way that I know things can boil down to, people want things at least to boil down to religion so bad and morals, but then it ends up just boiling down to resources. And not only that, but the very secularization of land and water. If that makes sense. If it doesn't, hold on, I'm coming for you. So by that, I mean like the way that we can spend time being able to be like, this is my pen and this is your pen. Follow me. Just follow me. I know it's a colored pencil, but the way that we will kind of battle for a pen versus something to color with and not see them both as forms of writing, as forms of creating and drawing, if that makes sense. And I feel like we're like, sure, maybe it's not that serious as pen and colored pencil, but it's like we're losing the very essence of the spirit of things, because we have secularized them. We've become obsessed with the very physical things. And I feel like another good example is currency, money. There's like a song lyric, wealth is unobtainable with their currency. And that's really just talking about the fact that I think a lot of people have gotten so caught up in making a dollar. I think people forget that wasn't our original currencies. So caught up in capitalism and stocks and bonds that it was never. We forget the economies that have existed, and it's like, oh, well, we can't go back there. Like, why are you talking about that? And it's like, to be absolutely real, I was just like, I feel like we can always return. It's just the act of knowing what you're returning to, right? I think the idea that we have to depend on capitalism is very much the colonial mindset, the way that we can never get out of a discussion beyond capitalism. It's the same with reparations. Oh, who's going to fund that? And it's just like there's always been more than enough to go around. The lie and where you've been colonized is when you were told and started to believe that there's not enough, that there's a scarcity, and like the body, mind, and spirit kind of follow. That was a little long, but you get me. I had to look around because it deleted what I was recording. Crazy, but it's fine, we move. I was talking about the way that part of this book was talking about how even the way language has affected children in terms of colonialization, because language has been forced into a sort of colonial alienation in which the child is kind of disassociated from their natural and social environments because there is a reinforcement in teaching of history, geography, music, where the bourgeoisie of Europe are at the center of the universe. And this section was talking about the way that like children are constantly, or this child in this case, this African child being exposed to a culture that was a product of a world external to himself, never part of these worlds, but in it, that's what it's giving. And it said, the images of this world and his place in it, implanted in a child, take years to eradicate if they can ever be. So the next quote, it discusses the fact that this was getting into African theater. I had to reread, and there was like a quote from a poem that I really liked, and it was like, to have factories and even big industries is good, very good. It is a means of developing the country. The question is this: who owns the industries? Whose children gain from the industries? The content of the play was asking many questions about the nature of Kenyan society, and this generated even more heated discussions on form and content during the entire period of the play's evolution. So this was just discussing the way that they were going back and forth creating art with each other, especially in the form of plays. Continuing on that note in the book, especially getting into the chapter 2 or essay 2 of the book, African Theater, the author was talking about the way that theater or art gets used to, like I said, center the European bourgeoisie. And he was talking about that in this quote. So, such a theater is part of the general bourgeoisie education system, which practices education as a process of weakening people, of making them feel they cannot do this or that, or it must take such brains. In other words, education is a meaning of mystifying knowledge and hence reality. Education, far from giving people the confidence in their ability and capacities to overcome obstacles or to become masters of the laws governing external nature as human beings, tends to make them feel their inadequacies, their weaknesses, and their incapacities in the face of reality, and their inability to do anything about the conditions governing themselves, their lives. They become more and more alienated from themselves and from their natural and social environment. Education, as a process of alienation, produces a gallery of active stars and an undifferentiated mass of grateful admirers. The Olympian gods of the Greek mythology or the dashing knights of the Middle Ages are reborn in the 20th century as superstar politicians, scientists, sportsmen, actors, the handsome doers, and heroes, with the ordinary people watching passively, gratefully, admiringly. And this reminds me of how we're also shown and taught just to accept things as they are and not want more in certain cases. Oh, it'll always be like this, and the rada exactly points me back to scarcity. It points me back to not just lack, like a lack mindset, but like perpetuating a negative perception about general people's role in society, and if that makes sense, like it's giving like there's only a certain elite and the regular people, like, which is weird. So this next book, they're talking about theater, they're kind of reflecting on their experience, and someone was just like, I felt like I was doing some important to the nation by teaching the songs that we use in Agika Indina, and that's why I'm involved in Matu Nigeria, which was like the play that they were putting on in Kenya. And he was talking about the fact that to him, the experience of participating in theater showed how history can be brought to the fore through drama so that children may know that what their past was like and so that they may help in the building of a healthy society. And I think someone had mentioned during rehearsal, excuse me, I have discovered so much I did not know about my own history. I can say with confidence that I know and am still learning a great deal about my own culture. Knowing more about my past has made me more sensitive to my present situation and that of my future and the future of my children. And I feel like even now in the world we're seeing, it's a privilege to know history and to have the resources to engage with history, not just in books, but in art, in culture, and practice. And how much you come to know even more by understanding what was. Sankofa. So I really like this quote as well. For instance, the reorganization of labor under capitalistic agriculture and industry meant productivity, and possibilities of wealth on a scale unknown before under feudal and communalistic systems. But the colonial system, through repressive racist ideologies, ensured the private appropriation of that wealth in a few hands, mostly white. Imperialism thus introduced mass poverty and cross-regional underdevelopment. Capitalism introduced plenty and possibilities of the conquest of hunger. Capitalism ensured poverty and mass starvation on a scale unknown before. Capitalism and the development of science and technology introduced the possibilities of the conquest of nature. Capitalism, by its uncontrolled use and exploitation of natural resources, ensured the virtual dominance of nature over man by ways of droughts and desertification. Capitalism introduced a new medical science to conquer diseases. Capitalism, through its selective prescription of medical care, at least in the colonies, ensured a disease-ridden population who now lacked help from the herbalists and psychiatrists, whose practices had been condemned as devilry. And this kind of reminds me, I know that the rest of the quote kind of gets in how imperialism, especially starting with, who's that person that I can't think of? It starts with the Roman Empire. Their name starts with an N, but using the Bible to display a message of subservience, and kind of organize the military for conquest and organize people for intensive labor and taxation. So the more you know, and I feel like this book was just pointing out a lot of this, like language, again, as communication, as culture. So this quote was talking about imperialism introducing literacy, but often confining it to specific groups of people like soldiers and policemen, but also the way that even when literacy becomes more widely available, the way that, again, government will, through licensing laws, try to control the content that's being carried for the literate. Thus, imperialist pretenses to free the African from superstition, ignorance, and awe of nature often resulted in deepening his ignorance, increasing his superstitions, and multiplying his awe of the new whip and gun wielding master. An African, particularly one who had gone through a colonial school, would more readily relate to the Bible with its fantastic explanation of the origins of the universe, its divine revelations about the second coming, and its horrifying pictures of hell and damnation for those sinning against imperialist order, than to the novel with its careful analysis of motive and character and action, and its general assumption that the world in which we live can be understood or at least analyzed through observations of patterns of behavior of individuals or the changing patterns of human relationships between groups and individuals. And that reminds me of how, like, even today, I think because of colonialization and people realizing that it was being used to subjugate people, on the other hand, there's a lot of people that don't want anything to do with it, especially when we're talking about Christianity and the Bible, because they were able to formulate, they were able to kind of coax people into making Christianity a religion versus something you embody, something you are. Instead of it being about something you are, it had to be something you did so that they could tax you, so that they could force you to do labor you didn't want to do, for you to obey masters you didn't want to obey, mm, develop nice masters. Okay, so the next quote was talking about the way that fiction as language can find its form through the ability to reconnect the mainstream of the struggles of African peoples against imperialism, and rooting in itself in the oral traditions of the peasantry. So trying to discuss this quest for relevance ultimately is what he moves on from theater to fiction to relevance. And he was talking about what he was really after being liberating the perspective within which to see ourselves clearly in a relationship to ourselves and to others in the universe. That being the quest for relevance. So, and he's talking about this because how we see a thing, even with our eyes, is very much dependent on where we stand in relationship to it. So in the book, he's pointing out how we viewed ourselves, our environment even, is very much dependent on where we stand in relationship to imperialism and its colonial and neo-colonial stages. That if we are to do anything about our individual and collective being today, we have to coldly and consciously look at what imperialism has been doing to us and to view ourselves in the universe. And he says, certainly the quest for relevance and for a correct perspective can only be understood and be meaningfully recovered within the context of the general struggle against imperialism. And he also talks about the way that literature, again going back to fiction, historically has tried to always discuss or leave, especially in racist literature, leave room for two types of Africans: the good African, which is the one who cooperates with the European colonizer, particularly the African who helps the European colonizer in the occupation and subjugation of his own people and country. Such a character was portrayed as possessing qualities of strength, intelligence, and beauty, but it was the strength and intelligence and the beauty of a sellout. The bad African character was the one who offered resistance to the foreign conquest and occupation of his country. Such a character was portrayed as being ugly, weak, cowardly, scheming. The reader's sympathies are guided in such a way as to make him identify with the Africans collaborating with colonialism and to make him distance himself from those offering political and military resistance to colonialism. And he discusses regimes in Kenya and the Ivory Coast, which have virtually, he says, mortgaged their future um, and the future of their countries to Euro-American imperialism. And those countries that do that or practice that are often portrayed as pragmatic, realistic, stable, democratic, and are often shown as achieving unparalleled economic growth for their countries. And I saw it like even like this past year when I think Kenya announced a partnership, like the Kenyan government announced a partnership with a university, and it was just like it was like giving the news article just kept referencing like another economic move, and it's just like crazy. Another quote that I did like was economic and political control of a people can never be complete without cultural control. And I feel like that's just another great reminder, and it was mentioned earlier. Um, but I guess like to better explain that, I'm trying to like see if there was like another quote that I had, but I guess like it would be this one about Kenya's educational policy, because in Kenya there was they had designed colonial policy in education, and it was which was prior to independence, and it was designed to educate the people of Kenya into accepting their role as the colonized, um, including literature syllabuses that centered on English literary traditions, further alienating children from their country. And you're probably like, how does that alienate them? But you're not. You become to know yourself through London and New York, not Nairobi and Eldoret. Like, in being there, that's like when I was living there, it was kind of like there's a difference. There's a different language that's needed for the context in which you're living. Not just different language, but a different literature as well, which is what he's getting at. Like to be able to dream of yourself in certain places and spaces before ever occupying them in your language, within your culture context, and how critical that is. Um, I remember, for example, learning about the Mau Mau, which were the Kenyan resistance fighters to colonialism. And some people will talk about them like proud to know their history, but like some might discuss like they did nothing for us, like the British were so invested in us before, like we fought back. And it's just like, okay, okay. And I think that brings me to another quote, which really discussed like the way that like a lot of people. He was talking about like the way that a lot of African writers and authors want Kenyan children to be exposed to literature within the Caribbean or Afro Americans, and he was just like, it's often asked why study their literature. What's the connection between African, West Indian, Afro American? Like, and he was discussing that we have the same biogeographic roots. We were all brutally uprooted. We have shared same past of humiliation, exploitation under slavery and colonialism. We also shared the glorious past of struggle and fight, as well as aspirations of total liberation of all Black people all over the world, and how critical that is um, to be sharing and being cognizant of as well. And another quote was the fact that um, there was like a report that was done, um, and they were talking about how they see literature as part of the whole ideological mechanism for integrating people into the values of the dominant class, race, or nation. Imperialism, particularly during colonialism, provides the best example of how literature as an element of culture was used in domination. That um, in this report, they talk about that Africa was a continent that's been a victim of forces of colonial exploitation, oppression, and human degradation. In the field of culture, she was taught to look on Europe as her teacher and the center of man's civilization and herself as the pupil. In this event, Western culture became the center of Africa's process learning, and Africa was relegated to the background. Africa uncritically imbibed values that were alien and had no immediate relevance to her people. Thus, was the richness of Africa's cultural heritage degraded, and her people labeled as primitive and savage. The colonizers' values were placed in the limelight, and in the process evolved a new African who denied his original image and exhibited a considerable lack of confidence in his creative potential. And this reminds me a lot of a conversation that I was having with someone from Brazil, like an employee, and he was talking. I ended up bringing up the fact that um, Portugal just like I had visited Portugal, and he's from Brazil, and I think he's been in Portugal, and he was asking my thoughts, and I was just like, I just feel like Portugal's a poor country. Like without African peoples, you had nothing. You had nothing to go off of because that was where your maritime came from. That's where the being able to cook something in the first place came from. That's where you have the improvement of sewer and wastewater like systems, like all these different things in Portugal. I was like, that's all ours. Like, what makes you special was things we just do regularly, which is interesting to me. So, like for example, I can point out things like astrology, being able to notice the star positioning and location and navigate water and land. A lot of those type of skills were sought by the Portuguese and African peoples. It wasn't them necessarily doing it, but they definitely took the credit. So next, let's see. What's the next quote I'm gonna share? I think one quote that I really liked was, "For them, the quest for relevance is not a call for isolationism, but a recognition that national liberation is the basis of an internationalism of all the democratic and social struggles of human equality, justice, peace, and progress. For them, the neocolonial state is the negation of Africa's progress and development, the defeat of imperialism and neocolonialism, and hence the liberation of natural and human resources and the entire productive forces of the nation would be the beginning of Africa's real progress and development. The national, viewed from the needs and activities of the majority, peasant and workers, is the necessary base for a takeoff into the world of the 20th century and 21st centuries, the international democratic and social community of tomorrow." And I feel like that was just pointing out to me, it was reminding me of how, like, kind of going back to what I was saying about Portugal. Um, if we're not careful, the narrative becomes, look how they made us. Look what they've done for us, how they've furthered our societies. It's what we've done for them. It's always been what we've done for them, how we've developed their societies and pushed the needle further globally. Like, remember that. Okay? So, what's the next quote? I think I think this is one of the last quotes. Yeah, one of three. It's like this really long. It's not really long, but the quest for relevance were basically challenges as to where people stand in the big social issues of the world today. And in the era of imperialism, where do we really stand? In a society built on a structure of inequality, where do we stand? Can we remain neutral, cocooned in our libraries and scholarly disciplines, muttering to ourselves, I'm only a surgeon, I'm a scientist, I'm an economist, or I'm simply a critic, a teacher, a lecturer? As Breach says in a poem addressed to the students of the workers and peasants faculty, your science will be valueless. You'll find and learning will be sterile, if inviting, unless you pledge your intellect to fighting against all the enemies of mankind. Or his poem addressed to Danish working class actors, and that is where you, the actors, as you learn and teach, can play your part creatively in all the struggles of men in your time, thereby helping with your seriousness of study and the cheerfulness of knowledge to turn the struggles into common experience, injustice into passion. And another thing, when another quote, which is a part of this, is when one day the simple men and women of all our countries will, as foreseen in the poem addressed to apolitical intellectuals by the late Guatemalan poet Odo Rene Castillo, rise and ask us what we did when our nations died out slowly, like a sleep fire small and alone. Yes, when they will ask us, what did you do when the poor suffered, when the tenderness and life burned out in them? We who teach literature, history, the arts, culture, and religion should be able to answer proudly. We help turn the struggles into the spheres of common knowledge, and above all, justice into passion. And I think, yeah, I just really like that quote because I think about that a lot, especially being in engineering. I feel like a lot of people have always been wanting to regulate people that like engineering in their own ways. Even as a grad student, I've kind of noticed that, like, you can never do be so interested in culture and still be a part of engineering. And and I was just like, and I think that's the problem. It's probably part of the problem. Like, we've tried to apoliticize something that was politicized. No? Okay. So I guess one of my last quotes. This is just talking about how 150 years ago, 40 years before the Berlin Conference, which kind of divides up, I say kind of, but it divides up the nations of Africa into different realms and places that you're. So this is a quote on a German visionary who saw how money taken from the worker and the poor had come to dominate human relation. It transforms fidelity into infidelity, love into hate, hate into love, virtue into vice, vice into virtue, servant into master, idiocy into intelligence, and intelligence into idiocy. He who can buy bravery is brave, though he be a coward. He saw a new world based on relationship, not of stolen property, but of human qualities, calling forth even more human qualities in all of us. Assume man to be a man and his relationship to be a human one. Then you can exchange love for only love, trust for trust, etc. If you want to enjoy art, you must be an artistically cultivated person. If you want to exercise influence over people, you must be a person with a stimulating and encouraging effect on other people. Every one of your relationships to man and Nature must be a specific expression corresponding to the object of your will, of your real individual life. If your love without invoking love is in return, that is, if your love as loving does not reproduce reciprocal love, if through loving expression of yourself as a loving person you do not make yourself a beloved one, then your love is in part a misfortune. So, one thing that the next book that, or the next quote, it's kind of in the same area, just a bit further down, is a Vatican, not a Vatican, my bad. It was not a German Pope in the Vatican, but Karl Marx in the British Museum Library that threw together a challenge for all scholars, philosophers, and, academics, in which he wrote, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is, however, to change it. And I'll end it with this quote that kind of has another quote from Breach on speech to Danish working class actors on the art of observation. Today, everywhere from the 100-storied cities over the sea is cross-plowed by teeming liners to the loneliest villages, the word has spread that mankind's fate is man alone. Therefore, we now ask you, the actors of our time, the time to overthrow and of boundless mastery of all nature, even men's own, at last, to change yourselves and show us mankind's world, as it really is, made by men and open to alteration. And he says that this is what this book was about. Like this book on politics of language in African literature, it was really about national, democratic, and human liberation. And the call for rediscovery and the resumption of our language is a call to regenerative reconnection with the millions of revolutionary tongues in Africa and the world over, demanding liberation. It's a call for the rediscovery of the real language of mankind, the language of our history. Struggle. Struggle makes history. Struggle makes us. And struggle is where our history, our language, and our being, that struggle begins wherever we are and whatever we do. Then we become part of the millions whom Martin Carter once saw, sleeping not to dream but dreaming to change the world. And that's all I have for you. See y'all. Bonus. But the search for new directions in language, literature, theater, poetry, fiction, and scholarly studies in Africa is part and parcel of the rural struggles of African people against imperialism in its neo-colonial stage. It is part of the struggle for that world in which my health is not dependent on another's leprosy, my cleanliness, not another's maggot-ridden body, and my humanity, not on the buried humanity of others. Peace. For real this time.